Everybody and their mama are telling first time investors, put your rental in an LLC, protect yourself, okay? And look, I get it. It sounds responsible, it sounds official. You file some paperwork, you pay a fee, and suddenly you feel like a real investor, right? It's great. But here's what nobody tells you: a badly run LLC is actually worse than just putting the investment property in your personal name. I know, I'm not saying don't get one. I'm saying if you're gonna do it right, because I've seen people think that they are protected and find out the hard way that they actually weren't. So, I'm Ashley, corporate attorney, real estate investor, and private money lender. And today we are gonna get into all of it, all right? So here's the decision that every single first time investor faces at some point. And it's the question of, do I put this property in an LLC or do I just buy it in my personal name? And look, both options are actually valid. So I'm not the one that's here to tell you like there's one right universal answer or anything like that. But what I am here to tell you is that there's some very specific things that you need to understand before you decide on whether to put it in your personal name or whether to put it in an LLC. And the choice that you make actually has tons of implications, right? It can affect your taxes, it can affect your financing options, it can affect your privacy, and most importantly, it can affect whether you're actually protected if something goes wrong. So, we're going to cover three things today: the case for buying the property in your personal name, the case for buying the property in an LLC, and then the thing that nobody talks about enough, which is how you can do all the right things on paper and still lose your protection completely. The last part, that's the one that I really need you to hear. So let's start with personal name, because I feel like buying an investment property in your personal name gets a bad rap. First, one of the benefits is that financing is way easier, okay? If you are a first time investor going to a conventional lender, they're not excited about lending to a brand new LLC that you just made last week, okay? You ain't got no credit history, no track record, nothing. But you as an individual, you probably got a nice source of income, good credit score. It's looking real cushy, right? And so that matters, right? When the lender is thinking about you and the risk that you bring to the table, looking at an established human being and the fact that they're stable and have recurring income and all those things feels better than this random entity that you formed, like I said last week. Okay. The second thing is, depending on your state, there can be homestead exemptions and other protections that only actually apply when the property's in your personal name. Okay. So the moment you transfer it to an LLC, you might lose those. There's also the risk that your funder has a clause about transferring to an LLC, right? A lot of times, hard money lenders will have something in their agreement saying this, if transferred, is due on sale, right? And so that can be triggered depending on how it's interpreted. You could also just not deal with that at all. The third thing is, if you have one single family rental with good landlord insurance, right? Because let's say you're just starting out, your actual liability exposure might be lower than you think. Okay. Now, I'm not saying don't ever use an LLC. I'm saying don't let somebody scare you into forming one before you really understand the full picture. Because here's where it gets interesting. Let's talk about the case for an LLC. Okay. So, why do people form LLCs, right? I mean, and why use them in your portfolio? Like, I use them in my own portfolio. And it really comes down to one word: separation. All right. When your rental property is in an LLC and a tenant slips on ice or trips down the stairs because they're hella clumsy, or they just decide to sue you for whatever reason, they're suing the LLC, right? They're not suing you. They're not suing your personal bank account. They're not getting access to your savings. It's the LLC. That's a big deal when it comes to building, right? A lot of us get into this investing world because we are building something bigger. Most people who get a rental property aren't just planning to stop with one rental property, right? Let's just be real about that. They're usually thinking of getting a few or expanding in some sort of ways. They're building a legacy, right? And so when you are building, that's important because privacy comes into play. In a lot of states, when your property is held by an LLC, your personal name doesn't show up on the public record. Not every state, a lot of states. That matters the more your portfolio grows and you become more findable. And then there's the scaling argument, right? If you ever want to add a second, a third, a fourth property, having a clean LLC setup and structure from the jump makes everything way easier. Your bookkeeping is cleaner, your liability is segmented, and it just looks more professional to future lenders and partners, right? So, yes, the LLC definitely has some real benefits, not denying that, but only, and I mean only, if you actually run it correctly. And that brings me to the next thing that I really want to talk to you about. So, there's this legal concept. I know lawyers and their legal concepts. There's this legal concept called piercing the corporate veil. I know it sounds like something out of a law school exam, and it is out of a law school exam. But stay with me because this is the part that could actually save you. So, in plain English, a judge can basically look at your LLC and say, this isn't a real entity, right? It's not actually separate from its owner. Okay. It's just a person pretending to have an LLC. And when that happens, when a judge looks at your LLC and says that, all your protection goes out the window. You're not protected at all. Gone. Pretty much like you never formed the LLC. It's tragic. This can absolutely happen. There are real court cases where investors did everything right and it's on paper looking real good. They filed the LLC, they paid the fee, they got the operating agreement, they have the EIN, blah, 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 blah. And a creditor still got access to their personal assets because of how they operated that LLC, right? The number one mistake I see people making with their LLC is commingling funds. This is the big one. If you are running a rental through your personal bank account, paying the mortgage from your Chase checking account, depositing the rent in the same account you use to get your Instacart groceries, you've already started to blur the line, right? And you have to have a separate account for your LLC and treat it as such, full stop. No negotiation here, okay? The second point is there is no operating agreement, right? Or they have an operating agreement, but they never actually used it or followed it. A lot of people form an LLC online with some random service. They get a certificate and they think they're done. The number of times I have met an investor or a business owner who does not have an operating agreement or does not know what their operating agreement says. I mean, if I had a penny for every time, I'm telling you, I would be retired. But if you've never signed an operating agreement, never had a basic annual meeting, at least on paper, never documented major decisions that were made in your LLC, a court is going to look at that and be like, was this a real business or is this a sham? Right? It's a real question. Even if you're a single member LLC. I know. It can be funny like that. All right. And number three is when you personally are acting and behaving like the LLC never existed. Okay. You sign contracts, but you sign them in your own name, right? You don't sign them as your LLC or as a member of your LLC or a manager of your LLC. You make promises personally. Okay. You never actually are operating through the entity. This one is sneaky because it actually creeps up on people who just kind of forget, right? They made the LLC because they were told to make the LLC, but then they went back to doing everything the way they always did. Okay. Look, I cannot stress this enough. A badly managed LLC gives you a false sense of security. Okay. You think you're protected because you did the thing, but you're not. Okay. And you will not find that out until something goes wrong, which we hope doesn't happen. Okay. So, real quick, if this is helpful, let me know in the comments. Let me know what questions you have. Feel free to subscribe, look at my other videos. I break down real estate and financial strategy in plain English, also private money lending, my favorite topic. No jargon, no fluff, but if there is jargon, I could tell you what the jargon's all about, right? All right, let's get back to it. So, what would I actually do to tell, a first time investor? Like, if I were starting out from the beginning and I was trying to figure out, like, do I make an LLC? Do I invest in my personal name? What would I say? All right, so two-part test, okay? This is my two-part test. The first question is, what is your actual liability exposure? So ask yourself that, like, what are the actual odds that something can go wrong, and how many assets do I have that can be touched if something goes wrong, okay? One single family home with a solid landlord insurance policy, your exposure might be pretty manageable actually. But the moment you get into multi-unit, or you're in a high liability situation, or you're scaling up to multiple properties, the math changes, okay? And you want that protection in place before something happens, not after. The second question in my two-part test is, can you actually maintain the LLC correctly? Like for real. Are you going to do what needs to be done? You know yourself. You want to separate that bank account, not use your own bank account. You want to have separate bookkeeping. I know, but I say bookkeeping and people be looking at me like, what? Like, you actually have to keep your books. It's a real thing. A signed operating agreement that you understand and actually follow. All transactions run through the entity, not in your personal name. If you are ready to take that on and do that, I say this with all the love in the world, an LLC is going to be for you, okay? If you ain't ready, don't do it, okay? If you're not going to do it right, don't even jump into this. It might just be a thing that you do that gives you false confidence. So be real with yourself and ask yourself, like, am I going to do the things? First, make a list of the things that need to be done, the types of compliance and management that it's going to take to maintain and run this entity. And then ask yourself for each one, like, am I willing to do this or not? Okay. Now, my actual recommendation for a first rental, and assuming you don't own nothing else, assuming you don't own your personal residence, assuming you don't have a significant amount of investments in, the stock market or anything else, you're just kind of really starting out. You may have a job, but pretty much no other assets. I would say get a solid landlord insurance policy first, okay? That's your foundation. You do not have to have an LLC to buy an investment property. You do not have to have an LLC to get a loan from a regular lender to get an investment property, okay? Then, as soon as you're ready to add on a second property, or your first rental becomes real income, that's when you can form the LLC, okay? And you set it up right from day one. Make sure you understand what it is that you've set up and what is required to maintain it. And you don't play catch up later, okay? The goal is not just to check a box and say, I made an LLC. The goal is to actually have the real protection that comes along with that, okay? Now, I hope this gave you a different way to think about this decision. It's not about LLC versus personal name. It's about understanding what you're actually getting and being honest with yourself about whether you're going to maintain it in the right way. So drop your questions in the comments. And seriously, I read every single one. And this is exactly the kind of stuff I like talking about. And this is the type of access I like to provide given my background. Okay. So if you want to go deeper on other topics, building your portfolio, private money lending, all the fun things, landlord headaches, I have videos on that too. So feel free to watch those.